right. I think we are all set to start the first session of day 2. Let's open it by a wonderful Marina. I've already introduced her. It's going to be a speech about scenario-based learning, how to turn boring courses into engaging experiences. Marina, are you with me? Do you hear me well? Are you okay? How do you feel?
Yes, I'm here. I'm excited. I can't wait for this.
Good, good. So I wish you all the best, and always remember, I'm here to help. If there is anything I can do for you, break a leg.
Thank you. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So welcome to scenario-based learning. So you're in the right place if you always struggle with creating e-learning courses that bring results and improve performance. You know that you need to include scenarios in your courses, but don't know when to use them and what type of scenarios work best for your content. You know that you need scenarios to explain certain concepts, but you don't know how to craft effective scenarios. So we'll talk about all of that today. So before we get started, let me chat if you ever used scenario-based learning in your e-learning courses. If you're familiar with that, what type of scenario-based learning you've used before.
We'll take a little time, but while we're waiting, maybe you could share, Marina, what do people usually answer when you ask this question?
So from my experience, there are actually two groups of people. Some people actually have a lot of experience with scenario-based learning and they actually prefer to create their courses using that approach, while others, they're not that familiar and they basically use the most basic type of scenarios in their courses. And as we'll discover today, there are several types of scenario-based learning. Also, I've noticed that now recently the new trends, a lot of people are actually turning to scenario-based learning. It's actually becoming a new trend. So we'll see what people say in today's conference.
Right. Yes, we already have many answers. Interestingly, it feels like it's kind of half on half. Half people say no, and they apologize for that. For some reason, they say, no, sorry, we don't know about that. And the others say,
there is no need to apologize. There's so many instructional designers who've never used scenario-based learning before. So hopefully you'll learn something today. That's actually a good thing.
Yeah. And the others say that yes, they have already learned quite a lot about that, and they do know and they have familiarized themselves with this term. And they also say regards to you, Marina, from all over the world, from Iran to New Zealand, from Johannesburg to Australia, Canada, and lots of places across the world. So Marina, we're all excited to learn about scenario-based learning.
I'm excited too. So before we get started, just really quickly, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about myself. So as you know, I'm an instructional designer, e-learning consultant, author, and a professional e-learning writer. I have more than 15 years of experience in instructional design and e-learning. So some of my credentials include a master's degree in instructional design. I'm also a Kirkpatrick bronze level certified training evaluation professional. And I also have some other certificates. You can read about me if you're interested. I'm not going to mention them right now. I was conferred with top leaders in education award for significant contributions toward the field of education at GFEL. And I'm also the author of the Instructional Design for E-Learning book, Essential Guide to Creating Successful E-Learning Courses. And that book has been used by multiple colleges and universities in the United States and also in other countries as well. And I'm also the author of some other books as well. And I created the companion program for the book, the Instructional Design for E-Learning program. So that's a little bit about me. So this session will cover the role of scenarios in e-learning, the elements of e-learning scenarios. We'll talk about simple versus complex scenarios. We'll talk about how to create interactive e-learning scenarios, and we'll also cover some examples of scenario-based learning. So hopefully you'll learn a lot from today's session. So at the very macro level, scenario is basically a story-based learning. It's set around realistic situations which highlight potential consequences of behavioral choices. They're built to generate learner interaction with content and provide meaningful feedback between learner and trainer. So it sounds a little complex. So let's explore scenarios in greater detail and understand their role in creating highly engaging and impactful learning content. So sometimes learners dread the thought of attending training. For instance, think about mandatory certification courses. They're boring and repetitive. It's not much to look forward to, not too interesting. At other times, e-learning topics may be extremely simple. For instance, a course of building fire protocols or something else, or it can be just rather very complex and or very technical in nature. Or courses, like I said, can be very technical. So like a course, let's say, on troubleshooting some digital weighting scales or something like that. So if you have courses that are either too simple or too complex, then you get learners to become really disengaged very fast, very quickly. So they're not interested in your courses. And that's where scenarios come into play. So by switching to scenario-based learning, trainers can actually turn really boring content into interesting and engaging, inject elements of practical application to stimulate learner interest, increase learner engagement by encouraging thought, reflection, and action throughout the course. And the challenge for most e-learning instructional designers is deciding how to design scenarios that actually work and when to use them effectively. So you don't always need scenarios, and when you do, you really need to ensure that you use them effectively. Like any component of e-learning creation, there are rules that scenario building should actually follow. So here we will talk about the 3 golden rules to keep in mind when putting together your scenarios. So again, I'm not, there are definitely more rules than that, but I'm just going to cover 3 of them today, simply because we don't have enough time for all of them. Focus scenarios on your training goals and objectives. This is very important because instructional designers want to make their scenarios interesting. They actually focus on introducing interesting situations, characters, and circumstances into the scenario. What they don't realize is that excessive focus on interest often leads to scenarios that are very clear to the learning goals to be accomplished, or the performance objectives cannot be met because of that. So your rule number 1 should be making sure that learning objectives are the center of your scenario. So we will not get too much into details about writing effective objectives because that's not what our session is about. But as a reminder, I just want to cover just very minor points. Some of them actually most important points, but very quickly. So your objectives should create expectancy and describe the structure of the lecture. So here's some ways to notify learners about the expected outcomes and objectives of the course, even before the course. You can summarize course goal and content or specify evaluation methodology and criteria. To ensure that your objectives are well written, you should use the SMART approach. And SMART objectives, as you probably know, focus on the result rather than the activities and allow learners to measure their own success, which is very important in scenario-based learning especially. This means that your objectives must be specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely. Bloom's taxonomy is extremely helpful in creating learning objectives. According to Bloom, there are three learning domains: cognitive, affective, and psychomotor. So when you write objectives for any of the three domains, you should always aim toward the most complex one. Typically, instructional designers use a classical approach to writing their objectives. As a result, the first element learners see when they start a course is the objectives. Even though the purpose of objectives is to actually help learners focus on their learning experience, most learners do not like to read the objective list and they just skip it whenever possible. So as a result, they end up not even knowing the objectives. And because of this, the value of objectives is actually diminished. But if the learners don't know the objectives, they can't benefit from the course. So the problem is that the instructional designers actually can't figure out the best way, the best approach between actually sharing the objectives that work for learners and not having learners actually even look at the objectives. So what do they do in this case? How do they actually turn their objectives into motivators? So first, before you actually start writing your objectives, first, before you start your objectives, you need to think about the business goal for the course. Then think about the actions necessary to reach that goal. Once a list of actions is compiled, you can actually begin your objective makeover. Not only should objectives be measurable and observable, but they should be motivational and relevant. Remember, you design courses for adults, and adults are busy, so they don't really have time to just read objectives that don't make any sense to them. So you need to ensure that objectives actually meet their needs. For example, if the objective with an action verb define is measurable, it's most likely useless, as in most cases, people do not really need to be able to define something to solve a real problem or master a skill. So while it's still a good idea to include definitions in your courses, turning them into objectives, basically not very practical. I think I skipped something. Here. Okay. You can also turn objectives into questions. For example, how can you tell if your supervisor is unhappy with your performance? So you just got out of a bad performance review. What would you do? Or something like that. Have you ever received negative job performance feedback? What would you do to repair your reputation? So basically, you're asking questions that make learners think and realize the importance of the content. Now, let's talk about rule number 2. Hypothetical scenarios often trigger hypothetical reception and learning. So, that will never apply to me. To stimulate interest and increase learner engagement, make e-learning scenarios as realistic as possible. Model your script around a real work situation or challenge, and keep roles and titles as realistic as possible. To accomplish that, you may need to meet with subject matter experts and have them actually share the stories that really happened on the job. Also, ask them to provide a list of terms that they commonly use. So the second rule is building learning scenarios around real-life situations and characters puts learning into relatable context to the learner instead of making it a hypothetical occurrence. So you want to make it realistic again. So your ultimate goal is for the learners to actually say, yes, that's me. I can completely see myself here. So sometimes focusing on real or realistic scenario may result in learner bias. So for example, learners are so laser focused on the plot itself that they fail to grasp the teachable moments of the scenario. To make e-learning scenarios more effective, provide adequate context so learners wade through the situation as it unfolds and don't dive into it heads on. So you really want to make sure that it's not just about the story, but it's also about the teachable moment, something that you're trying to teach. So don't just enumerate the reasons why something happened or could have happened, and instead basically explain what led up to the issues and provide remedial steps that might have resulted in a positive scenario outcome. Show learners actual examples of poor communication. Underscore weaknesses in the proposal with life examples. So again, include as many examples as you possibly can, and don't really focus too much on the story itself, but more on the problems that they need to solve. So again, rule number 3, don't just make the story a focus of the scenarios. Add a beginning and end along with descriptive annotations and exhibits to provide context and connection to the scenario. So here we're getting into scenario-based learning a bit, where it's important to craft your story with interesting plot and have a beginning and an end. But again, your subject matter experts should be able to help you here. As an instructional designer, you don't know the stories and you don't always have all the examples. So it's important to really work with your subject matter experts and have them share as many stories and examples as they possibly can. As I mentioned at the very beginning, there are actually 2 basic types of course content used in typical e-learning courses. Informational content and content aiming for behavioral change. So we'll talk about the 2 different types of scenarios a little bit later. But first, I wanted to just tell you the difference between the informational content versus the content aiming for changing behavior. So typical scenarios for informational content are simple to create, and content that requires behavioral change is a lot more difficult to construct. Overall, it's better to train and assess learners on higher level thinking and performance using more complex scenarios. And if you want to create scenarios for your informational content, they will most likely be simple scenarios. And again, don't worry if you're not sure what simple and complex scenarios mean, because we'll talk about it. So let's start with simple scenarios first. So what is a simple scenario? A simple scenario might work well to assess comprehension of basic instruction or information. It does not focus on assessing performance goals, performance gaps, encouraging decision making, it doesn't really influence behavioral changes. It doesn't highlight consequences from decisions or actions resulting from the scenario. So one way for you to use scenarios effectively is through multiple choice questions around short, simple scenarios. So you basically create a short story, and I'll give you an example in just a second. You create a short story, and then right after that story, you ask a question based on that story. So here's an example. So here's your scenario. It's 7 p.m. and the office is closed for the day. A mailman brings an important package for the CEO. What should the night watch staff do? Option 1, give the mailman the CEO's address and ask him to reroute the package. Option 2, call the CEO and ask for the instructions. Option 3, receive the package and hand it to the CEO's secretary the next morning. And the last option, call the night supervisor and ask for instructions. So as you can see, in essence, it's just a regular multiple choice question turned into a scenario. Not too difficult to construct, but again, it's all around the story And because of that, you may have to work closely with your subject matter expert. Now, let's assume that you need to design training for a company that has a strict no personal information exchange policy, and it enforces its chain of command very carefully. A simple scenario may work well in a training course on standard operating procedures. All information related to the scenario may already be covered in detail and appropriate procedures or employee manuals. So additional notes don't offer a hint of which response is right or wrong. So just provide additional context to help learners make the right choice. So when you create simple scenarios, you may need to provide additional background or explain the context. But again, the benefits of simple scenarios are that they're easy to create. So for the most part, they're basically multiple choice questions, and scenarios can make your courses a lot more engaging. But like I just mentioned, you need to ensure that you really explain the situation around the scenario and that learners can actually understand the full story. Next, we'll talk about complex scenarios. So if your courses focus on advanced behavioral change assessment, or if you're trying to address performance gaps or encourage complex decisions, then simple scenarios won't work. And you'll need to create complex scenarios, or you can also call them branching scenarios. Branching scenarios typically involve lots of decision making, where one decision from a scenario might lead to subsequent situations requiring additional decision making. So, one common mistake that I've seen people make is that when there are lengthy processes, they immediately assume that complex branching scenario is necessary, and that's a mistake. Complex scenarios can help when there is a decision-making process, or if you want your learners to experience a significant change in behavior. But long step-by-step processes will not benefit from complex scenarios, as they may just confuse your learners further. So that's where you need to really pay attention to whether you actually need a scenario or not. If you have something very simple, then maybe a simple scenario would work. If you have a situation that is a little bit more complex and that has some steps, then you need to start looking into branching scenarios. But if your content has a lot of moving parts, then you really need to reconsider, and maybe you won't even have to write a scenario, create a scenario for your for that particular situation. So complex branching is also a great use. It's actually a great use in scenarios where one situation could potentially have multiple causes. But the correct resolution of a situation may only occur if learners respond correctly to multiple series of questions. In this case, branching scenarios will teach learners the effectiveness of not just asking the right questions, but also determine when to stop asking questions and start acting on the information. A great example of the effective use of complex branching scenarios is an IT customer support training. So when a customer calls the helpline, he or she might only know the possible reasons that led to the call. They simply know that they had an issue, so they needed to call. And if you use complex branching scenario here, you may sharpen a learner's troubleshooting skills to enable them to determine the root cause quickly and even start the remediation action. So in chat, please let me know what types of scenarios you've used before. I know that a lot of you said that you haven't used any scenarios yet and that you're not too familiar with them. But for those of you who are, if you can let me know what types of scenarios you've used before, and if you've ever run into any issues with your scenarios, have you done any branching scenarios, or are you mostly focused on simple scenarios that are multiple choice questions? And I'll give you just a few minutes to answer the question before we move on.
Right. We are waiting for your responses, guys. What type or types of scenarios you've used before, and did you find them effective? And while we are waiting for the answers, I would just like to say that we have received several positive comments while you were speaking, Marina. People were commenting on how they find it very useful to know more about the scenarios, and they've also started asking their first questions. And we have also received a comment from one of our next speakers, from Tom. He says that what you're describing, Marina, is so true. Definition-based learning objectives are so frustrating, he's saying. Okay.
That is true.
Mm-hmm. Right. I'd like to read the first answers that we have received. Are you ready, Marina?
I am.
Fantastic. So Valerie is saying that these are simple and complex. Damaris says that these are classroom scenarios when discussing child development. Sarah Jo mentions simple scenarios. A. Powell mentions using real issues from manufacturing process to help hone troubleshooting skills of technical support team. And we really have a really large number of answers at the moment. I'd say at least a dozen, and many mention type of scenarios such as complex scenarios or simple scenarios, and the others are being much more specific with giving very, very clear situations when scenarios are being used. For example, scenarios showed situations the story characters had to navigate by posing questions to learners, or learners' choices triggered branches and learners could repeat questions, etc., etc. So quite a lot of engagement we have, Marina.
That's great. That's great. And obviously, more complex scenarios take a lot more time to create. So obviously, the development time increases. But yeah, that's good. Yeah, a lot of you are using scenarios already, and that's awesome.
Right. Okay. Would you like to wait a little bit more, or shall we proceed?
Let's proceed.
Okay.
We'll cover. Yeah, I just want to make sure we have enough time at the end to answer all the questions.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And we'll definitely talk about all these responses. So one thing that I did want to mention is that I'm noticing that there's a lot of technical content that people are using their scenarios for, and that's great because technical content is actually tends to be very boring, and it's very hard to create training that is engaging for scenario-based learning. So I'm sorry, for e-learning courses. So scenarios work very well when the content is technical, when the content is boring. And again, as I mentioned previously, it's highly recommended to work with subject matter experts to get as many stories as you can, and then turn them into your scenarios. So that's a really great approach to really spice up your learning a bit and make it more fun and engaging and interactive. But there's also place for simple scenarios as well. If your content is simple, don't overcomplicate it. Okay. Let's move forward.
Let's do it.
Okay. So scenario-based learning is one of the most effective ways to create highly effective learning content, right? Like I just mentioned. Why? Because unlike click next type of content, scenarios force learners to engage with content. And depending on how they structure the scenarios, instructional designers can stimulate critical thinking among learners and build anticipation, which in turn will increase retention, which is always the ultimate goal of any training, right? So we don't want learners to just learn the information. learning is not our goal. We want them to retain the information. So the objective of scenario-based learning is to provide realistic skills to learners that they can then transfer to the workforce, to their job. However, to produce realistic scenarios, we sometimes go overboard with too many details and lots of situational data. When we do this, we actually risk causing cognitive overload. Conversely, not providing sufficient data, sufficient information related to the item that you're teaching, the topic that you're teaching, or framing scenarios without first offering proper context may leave learners confused and they won't know what choices to pick. So it's very important to actually focus on the teachable items and frame your scenarios accordingly. So now we'll look at 8 building blocks that help to create highly effective scenarios. Okay, so first is the context. There's plenty of evidence to show that learning best occurs in the context in which learners plan to apply what they've learned. When building your e-learning scenarios, you should give consideration to the course objectives and create your scenarios accordingly. So for instance, if this is a sales training course, having scenarios related to acute patient care situations might not be the best way to go, right? So your scenarios should always correspond to the topic you're teaching, to the actual people to a target audience. Always be sure to stay on objectives and double and triple check that your scenarios actually meet the objectives. I know I already talked about it several times, but I just want to reiterate it several more times because objectives are very important, and having your objectives is equally important to making them engaging and interesting and actually actionable. Next is the story. Unless the scenario is an extremely simple one, story-based scenarios are more effective than just standalone situations. Building scenarios around a story not only helps learners relate to the course curriculum, but it also generates interest and promotes engagement. So make it relatable by using your real life work situations and captivating headlines and titles. So for instance, use a company failure as a teachable story, such as losing the best worker in the company, an in-depth look of what happened and why. Always make a compelling plot. In the above scenario that we just covered, it's tempting to dive right into the story and list what's and whys, but you want to build your story gradually to build engagement and create an effective beginning and appropriate ending as bookends for the rest of the scenario. And sometimes it's actually even appropriate to create several scenarios for the same story. So try again, I already mentioned, but I just want to say this again. Try to make your stories as realistic as possible. This is very important. Think about the details, key functions, and describe actual personalities involved in the story. Here again, it will be very helpful to talk to subject matter experts as they know the details much better than you do. And I always recommend sending your stories for review to make sure you've captured all the details accurately. Oh. Is being descriptive. That's another important element. The best e-learning scenarios leave nothing to the imagination and misinterpretation. Since the objective of the scenario is to learn from doing, learners must know what they'll learn from the scenario and what they must do right to reach a successful outcome. Descriptive language, scripts, and dialogue actually help in accomplishing those objectives. Always focus on behavioral change. So you'll notice that a lot of instructional designers actually call themselves behavioral designers, because they're trying to really implement to change your behavior, not just design courses that are meaningless. And some e-learning courses, they actually aim to inform learners. For such courses, multiple choice scenarios work just fine, no problem there. However, where behavior change is involved, and actually that's most courses, you need to make sure your scenarios include specific behavioral elements you're attempting to change. For instance, if one cause for losing the best employee was, let's say, I don't know, poor benefits or no work-life balance, or maybe there was something else going on at the job, then ensuring that scenario actually highlights the specific weaknesses and how they came about and how they can be avoided in the future, that's very important. Okay. Then you want to highlight your consequences. Real actions have consequences, and actions or decisions made in scenario settings must mimic the reality. This is especially true when building branching scenarios. So, if the training is related to client negotiations or customer service, so here are some questions that you may want to address. What would have been the outcome? Could the outcome have been different? What might have been the result if some activity happened in parallel with client negotiations? So, to be an effective learning tool, learners must be able to explore the consequences of each of these outcomes through the scenario. Okay? So some scenarios work best when learners go down a certain path and upon realizing they made an error or are stuck, can backtrack and go down a different path. Or they may decide to use the feedback they've received to pursue a different branch in the scenario. Best practices in scenario building are to provide jump-off points and exit ramps. So learners may decide when to stop exploring a scenario and either make a decision or choose a different path. So the best scenarios are ones that don't simply move the story along by asking learners to click yes or no or next. Instead, try to create inflection points in the scenario so that upon providing certain amount of information, learners must then interact with the scenario. For example, schedule a meeting with the legal department to discuss a non-disclosure clause in the contract. And they actually have to go ahead and drag things around so that they schedule that meeting. Or you may want to ask them to request additional information about specific features. And again, they have to go there and actually practice doing that. Or asking subject matter experts if a less expensive product or service might meet clients' requirements. Again, they have to really ask appropriate questions, and you may even have like an avatar pop up and then respond to the questions that they pose, and possibly even provide some feedback. And we'll talk about corrective feedback in just a second. So some scenario builders prefer to use the big reveal approach, where learners only receive feedback at the end of the scenario, maybe 2 hours into the exercise or somewhere in between. So most learners would, however, prefer to receive feedback throughout the exercise. That way, they review the consequences of their previous decisions and pivot to a new path if necessary. And what's the point of actually giving feedback at the end, right? So you want the learners to actually learn from that feedback. So instead, I highly recommend providing helpful feedback at different milestones. The feedback doesn't necessarily have to tell learners whether their responses are correct or incorrect. As learners move through the scenario, constructive feedback, such as reminders to remember something, can also help them help you deliver these teachable moments and actually teach valuable lessons. So if you don't know what went wrong, then how can you fix it, right? So as learners respond to questions, it's very important to provide them with reinforcement and remediation. As you plan your courses, you can plan to include automated means for learners to assess where they stand by providing confirmative feedback, corrective feedback, remedial feedback, informative feedback, and analytical feedback. So there are different types of feedback that you can provide. So let's talk a little bit about the types of feedback we just covered. So confirmative feedback is basically acknowledging that the learner has completed the required tasks, such as quizzes, assessments, assignments. Corrective feedback has to do with telling learners where they went wrong and why. And providing corrective feedback is imperative as it allows learners to progress toward their goal and tells them whether they have grasped the content from the course. So corrective feedback is very important. It also shows learners the parts of the course that need to be reviewed. So maybe they need to go back and revisit certain sections. When providing feedback to learners, you need to ensure that the overall tone is friendly and supportive, even if the questions were answered incorrectly and even if the learner completely missed the point. So now I want to talk about some of the approaches that I generally recommend as part of the formal corrective feedback process. So first is the so-called feedback sandwich approach. This is the approach where feedback providers start with positive comments about the participant's performance, sandwich negative feedback, and then close with positive comments at the very end. Next is the chronological feedback approach. In this approach, instructors enumerate the good and the bad observations in chronological order, enabling learners to get a sequential picture of how they did throughout the course, right? And then lastly, there is a clinical education approach. And this is more of a learner-centered method for delivering corrective feedback that uses a conversational technique to produce goals and action plans as a result of the feedback provided. So again, there are three types of feedback: the sandwich approach, the chronological, and the clinical. And the one that actually, I think I forgot to switch to a different one. Okay. I thought I forgot to change the slide. Maybe not. So the feedback that you pick depends on the content that you're creating, your scenario, and your audience, of course. But in addition to confirmative and corrective feedback, there is also remedial feedback, informative, and also analytical feedback. Remedial feedback is when you're offering advice and encouragement on how to remediate deficiencies. Informative feedback has to do with sharing useful information about performance improvement. And lastly, analytical feedback is delivering rule-based and fact-figure-based feedback on individual performance. So we're not going to cover this in detail, but these are the different types of feedback that you might want to explore and consider for your courses. So in the chat, please tell me about the types of corrective feedback you've used before, what type of feedback you prefer to use, and how do you actually usually provide corrective feedback to your audience?
Right. Thank you, Marina, for this question. We're looking forward to your answers, dear participants. While you're typing your answers, I would just like to make a kind reminder to Marina that we have about 24 minutes left till the very end of your section. So it would be lovely to leave some time for the questions, just a kind reminder about that.
And I will try to finish in 10 minutes and then leave some time for questions. Right. I will do my best. Stop me if you need to.
Okay, I will definitely. So we do also have quite a lot of quite an exchange of opinions in the chat among the participants about very different topics. So I assume this is a very good sign that the audience is very engaged, and they also learn not only from you, but also from each other, which is good to know.
That's great. That's great.
Yep. All right. Let's see. Yes, we've started receiving some of the first answers. Let's just give it 30 more seconds for more feedbacks to be collected to provide feedback regarding the corrective feedback. Right, so we have Vijay Kumar, who says, in corrective feedback, we explain why the selection is wrong and what would be the correct selection and why it is correct. I assume it's not, well, yeah, probably this is the type of an answer you were looking for, Marina.
Yeah, that is okay. Exactly what I was looking for.
Good. Then Sandra Crow would say it's remedial suggestion / advice feedback in quiz responses. Mohammed says that he has used one type of corrective feedback called PPC, positive possibilities and concerns. And Eva says she has used analytical feedback. So far, this is what I have received. I'm sure more comments are going to come.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Thanks for participating in this question. I know that corrective feedback, there are lots of different types of corrective feedback, and some instructional designers don't really provide corrective feedback, which is not necessarily the best idea. But for those of you who responded, I think you're doing a great job, and all the different types of feedback are definitely important for your learners. Okay, let's keep going. So not only does scenario-based learning enable exploring of common work-related situations, but scenarios can also prepare learners for unexpected, rare circumstances, which are highly unlikely to occur, yet devastating to the organizations if they do happen. And best of all, e-learning scenarios are low-cost, low-risk approach to equip learners with skills required to deal with real-life problems through an interactive, immersive, and safe environment. That's the key here, safe environment. So now let's look at some specific examples where scenarios might be a great way to deliver e-learning course objectively. First is skill development. One of the most prolific uses of e-learning scenarios is in the development of new skills or upgrading of existing ones. A great example of the application of scenario-based learning is in the healthcare sector, where medical staff, such as nurses or doctors, want to continually stay in the know with the latest developments in their field or aim to enhance their ability to deliver better and more effective patient care. So, for instance, trainee nurses may learn to accurately diagnose and effectively treat a variety of symptoms. Each patient might show the same symptom, let's say, different symptoms, or maybe even a combination of symptoms. Yeah, all might suffer from the same underlying condition. Learners may encounter a scenario where they actually help them diagnose patients with multiple conditions or multiple patients with several complications, each requiring detailed root cause exploration for a successful diagnosis. The use of branching scenarios, corrective feedback, and helpful comments throughout the scenario helps trainees learn from their mistakes. So they don't have to worry about misdiagnosing a patient in a real setting, but here it's a safe environment. Another benefit of scenario-based learning in this context is that learners aren't exposed to potentially dangerous or contagious environments, nor do they expose the hospital or the healthcare facility that they're working for to potentially costly litigations due to basically misdiagnosing a patient. So again, it's a safe environment, which is crucial here. So recertification is another situation where scenarios work really well. Most recertification is routine and doesn't really cover new materials. So learners find recertification boring and they often procrastinate. Recertification is not a choice, it's mandatory. And like most people, professionals hate doing things that someone makes them do, right? So that's where your scenarios really come into play and really help you make the learning more efficient and effective and engaging. So, and scenarios can really help turn, like I said, those boring recertification courses into more engaging experiences. So, by using different real life scenarios, professionals immediately relate to the training. And because the scenarios mimic their perceptions of the work environment, they're more likely to engage with and benefit from the training without having to read and reread hundreds of pages of the boring content. Right. So again, instead of just basically giving them manuals, you create interesting trainings. Like the challenges of certification training, organizations also face similar challenges when dealing with compliance training. For instance, data security, information privacy are trainings that the entire organization is accountable for completing. Scenario-based e-learning is a great way to engage learners and entice them to complete their mandatory training courses using multiple scenarios. For example, when holding health related when you're trying to, let's say, teach people how to handle health related private information, how to report maybe like financial data breaches, trainers can actually prepare learners to deal with various situations, different compliance issues, in a more interesting and engaging way, and actually see how they can relate. So many organizations find it easier to teach an employee how to disassemble and reassemble a complex piece of machinery than training them on soft skills such as listening, engaging in a professional setting, presentation skills, dealing with change, and so on. So scenario-based training is a great way to bridge that gap. And today, when so many people work from home, many employees struggle to find support to communicate remotely or to deal with the reality of changing work environment. They need help adjusting to the new reality, and e-learning scenarios can really walk employees through expectations of their new environment and give them the ability to make decisions on how to deal with specific workplace occurrences. The scenarios may be tailored to individual characters so that each employee actually gets a personalized dose of the soft skills needed to function effectively in his or her particular role. For instance, use scenarios about dealing with, let's say, angry customer, someone with limited communication abilities, to train a customer service representative. On the other hand, change management scenarios might be well suited for, let's say, leadership roles and positions.
Sorry to interrupt you, Marina. I'm so super sorry. We've got about 15 minutes left till the very end of this section. So what do you think shall we do with the questions and answers?
Okay, let's do questions and answers then.
Do you want to take one more minute to wrap it up now, or?
Yes, definitely. Let's see. Okay, so I just wanted to take a minute to tell you that if you want to learn more about scenarios and just basically e-learning how to create effective instructional design programs, you're more than welcome to join my instructional design for e-learning program. And it's comprised of 4 different parts, different sections. So the first section covers the basic elements. The second part is all about designing instructional sound e-learning courses. The third section is about interactive elements of e-learning courses. So we talk about scenarios and gamification, all this interesting stuff there. And then the fourth part is actually more advanced for advancing your skills. And if you do decide to join me today, I'm giving you a special code, the iSpring conference. So basically just enter iSpring conference and you'll get your 50% discount.
Sounds great. Yesterday, all of our participants were extremely happy to have received different codes and hints on where to continue their exploration of different areas mentioned by our experts. So I'm sure they would really appreciate that. Thank you for wrapping it up, Marina. I'm really sorry I had to interrupt you, but we have already several questions, and I guess it would be very helpful to get some answers, okay?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. So please feel free to ask me to move to the next question if you feel like you've already covered enough during your speech, or you feel like this is not exactly the question that you want to take. The first one we've received from Namazulu. And the question is, I would like to know how to make a storyboard using scenarios and how to put that on my LMS platform.
So this question, it might take some time to answer, and I would have honestly to answer that question completely, I would have to show certain things, but basically there's certain types of storyboards that actually allow you to script your scenarios. So the way I script my scenarios, usually I just write a script. So I did not use a storyboard at first. I just basically create a script. And then right after I create a script, I just take bits and pieces and I create several columns in my storyboard document. And then one of the columns would be specifically for the script. And then the other column would be for whether there is branching or not. And if there is branching, then I would tell them exactly where to go. So more like, I guess, notes for the developer. And then I would also have the screens. So usually for me, the storyboard needs to be visual. And also, if the scenario is actually more complex, and if the scenario is actually more of a, I guess it really requires a lot of branching and stuff, then I actually like to prototype more than storyboard in that case. So I actually use tools for storyboarding. You can use iSpring in this case, and you can basically just create very rapid prototypes that are not necessarily going to be functional. They're functional, non-functional prototypes, and they will really help your developer, or if you're the one who will be developing later, visualize the actual design. And then after that, you obviously develop, and then in the program, and then you will have to use different triggers, and you will have to really maybe even sometimes use multiple choice options to create your question, create your scenarios. So there is an option to use questions, the question template within the tool that you can use, and then you can obviously create your scenarios that way, just basically using multiple choice question, and then you just basically develop it just like any other course for your LMS.
Nice. Thank you so much.
That's real quick. I mean, obviously there's long, yeah, but because we don't have the time.
But it is still helpful to at least get this overview. I'm sure this is what Namazulu would appreciate. We have one more question from Zulami. Can you share actual example of the objective that have been turned to motivators?
So as I already covered in one of my, I think at the very beginning, so instead of saying after completing this lesson, you should be able to, let's say, create, you should be able to, I don't know, design motivational e-learning courses or something like that, which really doesn't mean anything. You could say something, uh, once you complete this lesson, your learners will be able to change their behavior by doing this, and that. So you're actually motivating your learners to do something. You're actually telling them what they will accomplish at the end. So instead of saying after completing this lesson, you will be able to eat healthier, you basically or you will know how to eat healthy, let's say. Instead of that, you basically tell them you after this lesson, you will lose, I don't know, 10 pounds. You'll be able to eat healthy so that you can lose 10 pounds. So that actually motivates them, because their ultimate goal is not really to maybe eat healthy because it doesn't really mean much to them, but they want to lose this 10 extra pounds. So you want to get to their ultimate goal. And I'm not sure if you're getting the slides or not, but I think at the very beginning, one of the slides actually had the objectives that were turned into motivator too.
Yeah,
So that would be
the
another.
participants will get the slides as well, so I'm sure they would be able to review that. So what you're basically trying to say, Marina, is that you're not only about to hit the right objective, but you also are to hit the right values, because all in all, these are very connected, right?
Exactly. You need to really look at the ultimate goal. Why is your learner there? Why
Yeah.
why do they want to take your course? Not necessarily what is it that they will just accomplish at the end, but why are they really taking your course? I like this 5 why technique where you
Yep.
ask why 5 times,
Exactly.
and at the very end you actually come to their ultimate goal for taking the course. And that's where how you this technique can actually help you turn your objectives into
Yeah.
motivators.
I think the one from design thinking, isn't it?
Mhm.
Yeah, all right. Thank you so much. And we have received an answer from Nomazulu that he's very happy that you have shared this and he's going to definitely use more prototypes. Thank you
Great.
so much for that. Yeah, good to hear your feedback as well. A question from Celine from Canada. I'm using only 3 multiple choice concept. I've read that it is more aligned with the cognitive heaviness. What is your advice on this?
Oh, what do you mean by 3 multiple choice
I
question?
think she was referring to your slide where you had multiple choice under point number 3, perhaps, if I'm not mistaken. So let's just say I'm only using multiple choice concept. I've read that it's more aligned with the cognitive heaviness, or maybe it implies that there are 3 options in the multiple choice test.
Yeah, I'm a little bit confused about the question, so if I can get some clarification on that. But basically, for multiple choice questions, they're typically used in simple scenarios, as I mentioned before. And simple scenarios are not, if you're trying really, like I mentioned before again, if you're trying to change your behavior or your learner's behavior, then multiple choice questions, they're not the best scenario types to choose. So you really want to get into branching a little more. And also, when you do just multiple choice questions as a task, then typically you use the options, the distractors that you use. You really need to write them in a certain way that they're not confusing to the learner. But with scenarios also, you're really there are multiple choice questions, but at the same time they're more like a story. So you're really crafting a story and you're asking your questions based on the story. So they look like multiple choice questions, but they're not necessarily straightforward multiple choice questions, because you're really, each answer, each response should be written in a way that makes your learners think.
Right, provocative manner. Okay. I don't think we have time for all the rest of the questions. So, Marina, I would offer you a multiple choice question for questions. I would offer you the topics that the questions cover, and feel free to choose the ones that you feel will be matching your presentation better. I have a question regarding storyboards and branch scenarios. I have a question regarding remedial feedback. I also have a question regarding turning objectives into questions. And I also have a question regarding virtual reality scenarios. Which one is the one that you feel like taking?
Let's do the objectives.
All right, objectives. Good. So let me see. That question was from Abraham. Could you explain or give an example how to turn objectives into questions?
So one of the example that I already gave. So let's say you have a situation where people are having problems at the job. They just can't perform, and something is just completely wrong, and their supervisor is constantly unhappy. So that's your situation. And the goal of the training is to really figure out what's going on, right? So again, we know that training cannot solve all the problems, and the only problem that the training can solve if it has to do with the skill. So let's say you determine that there is lack of knowledge or skills, and the person is just not performing well, right? So one of the ways to turn your objectives into motivators. So instead of saying after completing this course, you should be able to perform better or something like that at your performance reviews or something like that, you could say, so you just talked to your supervisor and just got out of your bad performance review. What can you do now? How can you resolve the issue? How can you fix the problem? And this will actually help you by asking this way. Okay, if you ask this question, then the learner might start thinking, okay, yes, I just had a bad performance review, so what could I possibly do? So you got the interest that they know that you will cover that in your lesson. They already know that your course will actually cover things that they need to do, the things that they need to focus on to improve their performance. So you just got out of a bad performance review. What can you do to improve your um, to improve your I don't know, next performance review, or what can you do to remediate the situation? So that actually gets again to the ultimate goal, why the learner is there, and that actually makes the learner feel, okay, I feel it, this is me. So that's what you want. You want the learner to feel, this is me. So ask the question that the learner would ask himself before they actually get into that training course.
Right. Thank you very much, Marina. I think this was very understandable and I think very helpful as well to get a better idea about objectives. And Celine clarified about multiple choice. She's saying that multiple choice should include 3 or 4 choices. That's what she meant.
Yes, that is correct. You should not have more than 3 and 4 choices, because otherwise, it gets confused. The learner will get confused. They're really confused. And the other thing is that, as you already mentioned, I believe it does have a really. It really has to do with cognitive load, and I'm not going to get into cognitive load a whole lot today. But yeah, you should really aim to 2 is not enough, but 3 to 4 is the best. I usually like 4,
Yeah,
but that's
okay. You like it 4. Okay. I think Celine also wanted to know your opinion about whether this is 3 or 4. So we got your point. 4 is what you prefer. Okay.
yeah.
Right. Marina, I really appreciate your time and effort that you've taken to, first of all, prepare for this session together with us and then deliver all this amazingly, I'd say, intensive and amazingly saturated content, if I may say so. This was super helpful, I'm sure, at least judging by my own interest and judging by the interest of the participants in the chat. It feels like they will be reviewing the session and definitely will be reading the slides again. I really want to thank you for that.